Hi, everyone. Today I am just talking to one of the artists. Well, sometimes you see art and you're blown away so much, and you get enraged because that's a level of mastery that you feel like you can never achieve. And this is the case with my guest today, Francis Vallejo. He is an amazing illustrator, painter, teacher. Um, so, welcome to the stream, Francis Vallejo.
Thanks, man. Yeah, happy to be here. And the feeling is very likewise. I think when artists get together like this, it's like, man, you're the best. No, you're the best. Which is cool, man. Yeah, it's very flattering.
Well, thanks. I don't feel. Uh, I feel like I'm the one who's right here, actually, but no, really, I love your drawings. I love the way you exaggerate stuff. You also did this series of jazz illustrations. Um, they have a balance between realism and pushed shapes. It's not completely caricature, but it has some elements of caricature in it. Uh, and I think it's painted traditionally, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that project, because I think that's just that blew me away when I saw that.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a big project for me. To give a little context, is that was about 5 years into my career. I was floundering, like which industry did I want to go to, and I I really enjoy your work because it goes in a bunch of different spaces. Sometimes it's a little more stylized, animated, sometimes more realistic, etc. And that was kind of like my journey, like where does my work exist? So I got the opportunity to work on this project, and that was a full kids book, 23 illustrations or so. And the first big thing that's important when talking about that work is all the pieces I did prior to that were for like editorial and comic, and the deadlines were very, very fast. And my process is very laborious. I based it off Norman Rockwell. I'm a huge Norman Rockwell nut, and so a lot of reference taking and multiple value studies, etc. So that process was really stressing me out in comics and editorial. Like, I'm not to say that you shouldn't be thorough, but it just there's a little more efficiency that has to happen. So when they offered me this project, they said, how long do you want to work on it? I'm like, what? I've never been asked that. Usually it's like we need it yesterday.
Yeah.
So I said 3 years as a joke, and they said okay. I'm like, whoa. So that's important to mention because I finally had time to visually experiment, which is debatably my favorite part in art making. Like I love just the act of drawing. Um, Equal parts of that though is playing with pictures and experimenting with how you can perceive and display a picture as far as grouping values and stylizing forms and warping perspective and all that great stuff. So I was the first project where I can really launch into that because I had so long. Um, so whether I would do it again or not, I spent out of 3 years around a year and a half just in process work.
Wow.
I photographed 18 models in period costumes.
Wow.
I hired someone out to build New York in 3D so I can move around, well, not all of New York, a specific street in Harlem so I can move the camera around, um, and try to get some interesting angles, especially some fisheye shots. And I'm like, well, I should probably start the finishes, and the publisher thought so too. So the finishes, I printed out my sketches, which I did traditionally but assembled digitally. I printed those out on watercolor paper with a Giclée printer, and I expected myself to paint over everything, but I ended up, because of deadlines, leaving a lot of those lines and open sort of airy negative spaces. And people were like, "Man, that was so cool that you did that. That was really smart." Like many things, it's like that was I was a victim of circumstance that just kind of happened. Then I did the finish with acrylic washes and pastel, and
Okay.
it's always worth mentioning because I'm an art history nerd. Some of the biggest influences were Bernie Fuchs, Gary Kelly, Albert Dorn, and then Maurice Noble with his like Looney Tune
Okay.
background.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, I'm glad I asked about this. This is so cool. Wow,
Yeah.
that's really amazing. So I'm just stunned, that how big are the originals?
So unfortunately I just moved, so my house is crazy. I tried to find the most cleanest corner. If I didn't move, I'd show you. They're upstairs in storage, but they're really big. They're like 22 by 30.
Okay.
Uh, so when I was emphatic that after all that time that I wanted to deliver them to the publisher in person, and I had this big box, and I went to Boston and I laid them out, and it took up like a room and a half. You
Wow.
lay them
Did you
out.
did you ever exhibit them?
I almost did a couple times. I've exhibited them a couple at a time at a
Okay.
few places. I've never had a show of like the whole body of work
Oh,
done.
that would be amazing. And
See,
so this is you work as an illustrator, but you also teach, right?
I do. Yeah, I and my dog is whining over here in the corner like a baby. Um, I do. I teach 3 days of the week, which is considered full time at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, Michigan, in the illustration department.
Okay. Is that easy to balance for you with client work?
No, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. Give me one sec. I'm
What's
gonna put my
oh, of
dog
course,
under a
yes.
blanket so she doesn't bother us. Sorry, everybody.
No, no problem.
Kira, you goofball here.
Now we can all have a look at those books he has there.
You good? You good? All right.
What would you
Yeah.
say is the biggest struggle in balancing those two?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the name of the game. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours on balance as an illustrator. Um, so I think teaching has been really incredible for me. It's been one of the best things that I've ever pursued in my life. You almost even more than art because I tend to self isolate. I tend to, which is ironic in this time, but I tend to avoid socializing, and I have self destructive habits in that extent. And I think teaching forces me to get out of the studio, to interact, to socialize, and to forget about myself because sometimes illustration can be very selfish pursuit. Um, so I'm super happy I do it. I want to teach as long as I can, and I'm privileged to. But that initial adjustment, which is almost 5 years exactly, to having to turn down client work and projects because I just can't do them. Like I don't have the time, and I
Mm.
want to be a good teacher was a big adjustment. And I think what I'm really excited about is uh, come September, I'm actually finishing my grad degree right now. So come September, I'll be done with that. I'll have all the classes sort of structured that I'm going to teach. Like I have the Francis Vallejo courses. Like I have all my materials. I'm not making any new materials. So for the
Okay.
first time ever, come September, I don't really have to create new teaching materials. I'm kind of cruising, and then I'm done with my grad degree, and I can really hunker down back into the freelance.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's cool. And
Yeah.
so, what is this Francis Vallejo course? What do you teach?
Yeah, I teach a lot of figure classes, figure drawing, which is, I mean, how crazy is that, man? I get paid to just get excited about figure drawing and draw and show people, tips and techniques. I mean, it's awesome. But a lot of figure drawing classes, anatomy, um, and mixed media class, which I'm maybe most proud of, is also, I mean, me as a teacher, I get up there and I start yelling because I'm excited about stuff, and then hopefully I help you out. So for like mixed media, I'm like, look at how CF Payne did this, or like check out this process that Thomas Blackshear used, or whatever, and then we just play with it. I always teach a senior studio class to kind of prep portfolios and another class for composition, like a upper level composition class. And that's the same thing. Like, look at how Reppin composed this picture. And like me and you were just talking about Diamond Kelly, you know, like look at how these values and drop off light and oh, that's so cool. Because I think that's part of my job as an instructor, is to communicate what's possible and to get excited about it and to share that excitement with the students. I think that's one of my main goals, because drawing and painting is kind of linear, but um, the mentorship of the possibilities of art takes a lot of mentorship, you know.
Yeah, wow, cool. I wish I could attend. Well, I think as a teacher there, because we're the topic is studying, where we're going to talk about studying. So I think as a teacher, you get a lot of insight also from a teacher's point of view about studying. Are there things that you learned about, how to study, or the, best way to study, that you didn't know before you started teaching?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I want to hear your perspective on that, also. Um, so let's see. I want to almost think about that for a second. Um, right. So, Malcolm Gladwell made this, everyone brings this up, the 10,000 hour thing. I think you want to have your brain turned on, though, is really important, and something I talk to my students a lot about. You can have 10,000 active intelligent hours, or you can have 10,000 very distracted, just trying to get it done hours.
Mm.
And I think the active, conscientious study is what we're shooting for. Um, to just give an example as an instructor, so a lot of contemporary students, say right now in the early 20s or so, are raised in a world where they only know the internet, and the internet's a bajillion trillion dollar industry where so many people make a living on trying to distract you. So it's interesting. I've walked into study rooms or open study rooms really, and I'll see a student that's on their phone and has a laptop with the YouTube going and is working on their homework at the same time. And I think it's possible. And I know a lot of painters that have like movies going in the background, but it's background, right? I think it's just almost like noise. So that kind of goes to my point of um, trying to understand what the point it is that you're trying to study. Like if it's gesture drawing, yes, there's part of reacting to the model, but also it's really taking a second to look
Mm.
and to think about what's going on, maybe bring in your mind some artists that inspire and have done good gestures, and to have a purpose in what you're doing. So I think that's really important in studying. And then I also always really think the application is a big deal. So I think first you're aware of what you're studying and that you need to know it in the first place. Then you study it, either given to you by a mentor or self. You kind of know it on your own. And then you study it, but then it's applying it in your own work. I think that's a really big deal. So say, for instance, you study about the muscles of the arm and you copy a ton of slides. I don't think that's where you should stop. Then you should go to a model session and then only focus on the arm and try to apply
Mm.
apply all what you just learned on anatomy. Because if not, it's going to kind of fade away a bit. You kind of need some time to get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking the 10,000 hour rule you mentioned. I always think, uh, what exactly happens after those 10,000 hours? Because for me, I think I have spent 10,000 hours drawing in my life, but uh, there wasn't this magic moment where I thought, oh, now I can do it. They say, well, I think what he says is then you are a master, or then you can do it, or I don't know exactly what it says, but I have a hard time understanding what it is exactly after those 10,000 hours that you achieve, because it's just such an ongoing process. How do you see that?
Oh, for sure, for sure. Art history is so rich of people that are a million times better than you, and I'm always looking at some of those pieces and like, well, I put in my 10,000, but they put in their 400,000, and that can get toxic to a point. But I think it's equal part after you get your 10,000 of just being proud and and at peace with your skill level. But there's always there's always going to be some drive to get better.
Mm.
And I think then becomes the challenge of finding time to do that. Like the example I always give is when I was in school, I always was horrible at ears. My ears were just garbage. I got just a bunch of squiggles. And I thought that for like 3 years. Like one, I had 3 bad ear years. And I always thought like every day, like I just need to spend a couple hours and learn how to draw the ear. And then I did literally a couple hours and I knew how to draw an ear. And that's crazy, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah.
think as a professional, we have these things like, for instance, I really want to get better at rendering lively expressions. I can do it, but sometimes they're stiff. And I've thought that for like 5 years and I just haven't put myself in a position to study it. And part of that, I suppose, is laziness. Part of that is logistical scheduling problems. But yeah, I think when you're out of school and you get your 10,000 is putting yourself in a place where you can afford to focus on those things.
Mm. Yeah, I think a school does that for you, and if you're not in a school, you have to turn those goals into actions. Because I hear you say, I would love to be able to draw ears, or I would love to be able to draw expressions in a lively way. And if I, that's something that if you are uh, an artist or a student, and you notice that you are telling yourself those kinds of things, then that's a cue for yourself to turn that wish into an action. You can just schedule, okay, I want to be better at drawing ears. If it's just, even if you draw just one ear a day, that's more than nothing, and just wishing that you could do it. So I think
Yeah.
turning your goals into specific actions is a really great way of studying, because then I think the best way to learn is by doing. There you teachers are incredibly important, but they have to uh, turn you make you active. To They give you an assignment, but you have to do it in order to learn from it.
I agree. Yeah. That self motivation to continue to ask questions to yourself and seek out how do you get those answers is such a big deal. And I noticed that a lot of the most successful artists are lifelong students, for sure. You'll never know anything, and I think that's really exciting. Now, we were talking before, like we're not going to retire, because there's new questions to answer.
Yes. Yeah, I heard that, if I'm correct, these are, but if I'm correct, Nathan Fawkes did a drawing class, and Glen Keane attended his class.
What?
So Glen Keane of all people, but he's still eager to learn, and I think that you know that's why these people are so good, because they just keep going and keep going. And for me, it's really curiosity. It's I'm just and maybe uh, I lean more towards that side of studying, because I'm so curious and I want to understand things, that sometimes I gravitate towards that more than actually creating art. How is that for you?
For sure. I think, and excuse the term, but I'm really interested in the idea of like visual masturbation, where you're just like, let me just play with the picture making and the aesthetics and just sort of like try new things. And I think I do get lost in that sometimes, and I think the balance is between that and the concept and the integrity of why the picture needs to exist. Because I
Yeah.
think I can do a million studies and those might get a ton of really exciting Instagram likes and all this or that. Um, but in the big picture, personally speaking, I think pictures with a clear, concise narrative and/or concept first, and then all that visual experiment visual experimentation, media experimentation, all of that second. But I think for most of my career, I've flipped it because I mean it's so damn exciting, right? Just to kind
Mm.
of play with those things.
Yeah, yeah. But you need to know what you're studying for.
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Cool. And so, how was it when you were in art school? Did you go to art school?
I did. Yeah. So the little story with that is, so I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I had almost zero art instruction in like grade school and high school. Actually, our high school art teacher got kicked out of the school for choking a student, almost like
Whoa.
Homer Simpson and Bart Simpson. You know, I was in the back of the class, like, oh man. So my senior year, I drew in the boiler room of the high school, and I like drew the boiler room in perspective to learn perspective and stuff. Um, and my main instruction was a Todd McFarlane How to Draw Spawn VHS. That was like my guide of this is what good art looks like. So the school I teach at now, College for Creative Studies, great school in Detroit. Uh, they didn't give me a scholarship because I applied to go there. Just I always tell my students like, hey, if you're kind of stressing, like I didn't even really get a scholarship to go to the school I'm teaching at now. So I went to Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota, Florida, and I mostly picked the school because they had palm trees and I'd never seen those before. They're
That's a good
completely, I,
reason. That's a
for sure. And you know, and looking back, like it was good to get out, but I literally didn't look at the quality of their art instruction. So I just happened to luck into the fact they had people like George Pratt that taught there that worked out.
wow.
Um, so yeah, I went to Ringling, and I think that really did well for me building a community of peers.
Hmm.
I just it a lot of my best friends in life. Um, just came from there. We still keep in touch. There was a high level of student there, particularly at that time. But as far as hardcore instruction, um, the summers between my junior and senior year and senior and after graduation, I went to the Illustration Academy, and that super changed my life. You know, just the focus on hardcore picture making, the most hardest things to teach, which I think is picture making. They had people like Mark English and Kelly teaching it. It's like, oh, I
Wow.
didn't realize at the time, but I talk about making pictures, you know. So I
Wow.
was very fortunate um, to get that, and um, just those are two really important like learning environments. And I'll just throw a third one is that after some time after school, I was kind of flustered with my work. So I reached back out to my mentor, George Pratt, and I asked him, I'm like, George, can I share a studio with you? I was so nervous, you know, like I could split the studio space, or is there any way I could like sweep up the floor and be in the space alongside you? And he was like, yeah, man, you know, just real casual, like George. And that was really big too, because that taught me how to live as an artist,
Hmm.
um, which is a big deal that we all try to figure out. Is making art's easy. How to live as an artist is really hard.
Yes, absolutely. And let me think. I had a question in my mind, but it flew away. By the way, if someone in the chat has a question, please write it down so uh, I can include that. Um, I went to when you mention all that and the teachers you had, I feel incredibly self-taught. Uh, I did go to art school, but um, I I was even more unaware of what I was stepping into at the time, and I didn't look at all at. Well, there were no palm trees either. There was nothing. No. So there was this one teacher uh, who was who was basically the only teacher teaching any technique at all. But it really for me it was more that I had the time to spend drawing rather than that they taught me at least, especially technique. I didn't learn much. So, well, I learned much during that period, but mostly because I wanted to. So, and also when I think of you teaching, I feel like, wow, I wish I had an education. I had an education like that because I feel sometimes like, especially when it comes to anatomy, I feel like I'm lacking so much, but also some of the terminology or the the approach to something, which is if you have a good teacher, they can structure this knowledge in a way that you step by step you learn how to deal with those things. And I'm just figuring everything out, which is easier now. When online you have so much resources, but still it feels like I'm you know I haven't I don't have steady ground. I'm just trying stuff and figuring it out, and that I think is a great way of learning. By the way, just trying stuff. But I really love when you have great art books or instruction or because it just helps you to structure things and understand things. So did they teach you that in art school when it comes to anatomy or life drawing or anything?
Not really.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, so that's just an illusion.
well,
No,
no,
I
well,
have.
well, so I had an interesting experience. So, um, I was originally an animator at Ringling, and that was bad advice. The advisor told me to do that because he's like, "Do you want to make money?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, you shouldn't do illustration. You should do animation." This was an advisor for the school.
Okay.
So I'm an 18-year-old broke as a joke. I'm like, "Sure, money sounds great. Let me do an animation." So the reason that's relevant is I switched majors. So I finished my third year. I was about to start my fourth as an animator and graduate. So I switched. So since I was decent, they allowed me to skip the sophomore year, which is debatably the most important year where they teach anatomy and all these type of things.
Okay.
So while I had a great community, and I think George Pratt was my entire art school experience, there was a lot of technical gaps um, that I'm similar to yourself that I eventually realized that were important, ironically, like anatomy and all these things. And I had to do a lot of self study to figure them out.
Okay.
And I think all art schools and Ringling has its shortcomings. But again, I'm really thankful for the academy because they taught me the stuff that was the hardest to learn. Again, like picture making.
Mm. And as a teacher, do you have a specific um, idea of telling your students how to study? Is there a way that you think is a good way, or do you look at each student individually and try to find what what their best way of learning is?
Yeah, and I think the underclassmen and upperclassmen is important because in the upper class, or I'm sorry, in the underclass years, like freshman, sophomore, there's a level of foundation and objective truths that we're trying to that they're literally paying us to instruct them to learn,
Yeah.
like understanding perspective and how to block in a figure and what is a thumbnail, all the foundational stuff. Then once they get to senior year, it's our job to encourage them to question all that, and that's when the instruction gets a lot more customized, and every student can go on a
Okay.
different route and that. Um, but I think me particularly, probably the number one thing I emphasize in my classes is understanding of art history. I start every single class with at least a half hour talking about a new artist. I have the students carry a sketchbook, and I really encourage them because every class I'll throw out a ton of names to write names down because I think there's a couple artists that I encountered in my journeys, especially Norman Rockwell, Ilya Repin, and Sergio Topi.
Hmm.
Um, that changed my whole paradigm of what art could be. And let me see. I think Repin came from conceptart.org. Someone posted it there. Um, uh, Rockwell, I might have came mostly from Pratt. I knew who he was, but I think Pratt reignited Rockwell because Rockwell is a big, or Pratt is a big Rockwell nut. And then Topi was also Pratt. But anyways, uh, those were huge. I wouldn't be the artist I am if I didn't wasn't aware of those artists. So in the same way in my classes, as much as I might teach you how to draw, I might casually drop an artist's name, and for the first time, that student might look at the art and feel like, okay, I get it. Like this is
Yeah,
the type
yeah,
of art I've been searching for my entire journey. Like now I have a target. You
yeah.
know, like, this is possible. So I think that's big on how I teach is I'm trying to show that, especially as varied throughout art history as possible, right? Because I think it's really easy to look at the popular artists nowadays and kind of not seek stuff out.
Yeah, but what you get then is, a couple of years ago there was, everyone loved Mary Blair, which is an
Yeah,
amazing artist, but at the time, uh, everyone was looking at that, and everyone's art started to look like that. And
right.
what you get then is this whole community creating similar art. And I think what you're doing is creating such a wide variety of influences, also not just from what's happening now, but also from the past. What I also love is to look at art from different cultures, Asian art from the past, or tribal African sculpture, or all those things. There's so much uh, richness, and all these people and all these cultures have came up with unique ways of expressing themselves through art, and they're using the same means. When it's sculpture, they have something that exists in space, and it has shape, and it has texture, and it has a design, but it's all so different. And I think if you, and I think you're absolutely right, because for me, I have those artists too. Those some of those artists that when you see them, and it can happen at any point in your life, but you just know, like, wow, this resonates with me. This now I know what I love to do. For me, David Levine is one of those artists. It's just like, and especially his watercolor portraits and his watercolors. It's like when I saw those, and I saw those when I was really young. I was like, wow, this is. I just knew it, that, and it's not like now I am going to do that exactly, but um, it just feels like, in a way, it feels like you when you have relatives, that
Yeah,
you can see that this is my cousin because he has the same nose, but at the same time he's a completely different person, and he doesn't draw, but you can see he is my relative. And in art, I feel you can have these same things. Sometimes you see art from an artist, and it's like, wow, this has a part of me in it.
absolutely. Yeah, and I've had a crazy experience that I think I'll share. Y'all might get a kick out of it. Is that um, also when I was in school near the end, I was turned into a giant Paul Pope nut. And so after I graduated, I had kind of a tough year the first year out, but I ended up getting what they marketed as the world's first comic book art residency, because usually art residencies are for like fine art and
Okay.
whatnot. So it was with Paul. It was actually Paul Pope, Craig Thompson, and apologies, Svetlana, I forget her last name. And so all of a sudden, like I was like that, particularly that time, I was really big on Paul Pope, and then I was in a forest or a swamp in Florida, like studying with him and a bunch of other people. But the reason I'm telling this story is, we'd eat dinner together. We would draw late in the night in this room, and it was really cool. But I was able to talk to Paul, and he's like, "Yeah, man, like I'm a kid from the Midwest. I really loved comics. I went to art school and fell in love with painting. I realized that what I really wanted to do was comics. I loved manga, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot more details than that. But um, I'm like, man, you're like me. I'm like, I'm a kid from the Midwest. I got into art because of comics. I went to school. I got lost in paintings, and I didn't have the manga connection, but I had my own connection. But it was so similar that
Wow.
outside of just appreciating the art, I really started to appreciate his journey and learn from his journey and how he brought in some of these influences. And to this day, a lot of the Paul Popeisms um, stick with me. Like he said, someone asked him, like, Paul, you put yourself out there a little bit along with your work. You don't just necessarily let your work speak for itself. And Paul's like, well, there's a reason that rock stars stand straight up on concert stage. And I'm like, oh, thank you, Sensei. But
That's
yeah, the
good.
reason I tell that story is you were talking about our influences, and some of it is the art itself, but then I think the act of when you really are reacting to that art, the art surface level to a point, if you can read about or meet, if they're alive, the individual, you get context, and that makes it
Yeah.
so much richer, and you can see how you can apply that knowledge to sort of like your work. Because just saying like I want to be as good as Norman Rockwell is great, and I think a lot of people could say that, but there's a lot of literature out there, and getting into his process and seeing the time in which he created the pieces and like all that stuff, I think is massively important if you really want to
Yeah.
absorb their work.
Yeah, and I think in this time it would be a completely different thing
Yeah,
because the whole world has changed. So just like a painter like John Singer Sargent, he I think a lot of painters would want to be like him, but the world has changed. He was a painter of portraits in a time that photography couldn't provide that, and there was this uh, huge upper class, rich people who would pay money to have those paintings made, and that all changed. And I think that's a huge part of why he even did that, because at a certain point he stopped doing those paintings, those portraits, because he had enough of it, and dealing with people and their reactions to the paintings, and he started doing these landscapes and all. So uh, what I'm trying to say is, that everything has a context, just like you mentioned, and also it's really a reflection of who you are as a person. So you can't really when people look up to some artists, some people like to copy the people they admire, which is a good thing, I think, in terms of studying. But if you don't, if you rest on that, then you will be a second-hand version of the one you admire, and that's because that person will also always be one step ahead because they are creating something from within that they are, and you're only copying that outer shell then. So I think it's important to understand why you are inspired by this person and how you can translate that into something that inspires you as an artist yourself.
for sure. Yeah, and it's fun to kind of play the game of what's their lineage, like who are the artists they were looking at.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
this isn't particularly accurate, but like almost for goofs, and I'm not trying to connect myself to Howard Pyle, but if let's say like if you wanted to, it could be like, okay, well, I'm who I am, and then I studied with Pratt. Pratt really studied with Jeff Jones. Jeff Jones's really big inspiration was NC Wyeth, and you go from NC Wyeth to Pyle. So like basically what I'm
Ah,
saying
cool.
is I'm
Yeah,
study with Pyle. No, I'm joking.
yeah,
But yeah, but for what it's worth, like every artist kind of has that lineage, which is really exciting. Like Jerome had such a massive group of artists that was around him, and Solomon J. Solomon, and all that sort of stuff. So it's fun to go down that rabbit hole, and
yeah.
and you know, and whenever I meet illustrators I admire, it always comes to this conversation. It's just like almost a standard is that everyone just really like gets into that.
Yeah.
It is. It's fun.
Yeah, well, I think we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and It's humbling, I think, because we all learn these things from one another, and you acquire a skill which maybe you could call something of yourself, but it's all knowledge that has been around for ages, and actually, um, you know, I don't even know if I could call that skill my own because. I also play music, and with music, it's really clear to me because it happens in the moment and it's gone afterwards. So with music, it's really clear that you have to focus at that moment itself, and then you can get into that flow moment where you feel like everything is happening by itself, and I feel the very same way with art. It's like I'm pursuing something, and I'm pursuing a little bird that flies away every time I want to catch it because I'm creating I'm working on a painting, and I have moments where I think, well, this is not going to work, and I keep working on it and adjust things, and then at the end of the struggle, I have this painting that I'm happy with. This like, wow, this is cool, and then I show it, people love it, but then it's no longer part of me. It's this separate thing, and if I want to do it again, I have to start that struggle all the way, all the way from the beginning, and it's
Yeah.
not something that I can grasp where I can say, oh, I can do this, and so now I'm going to do it all the time. It's a process where you have to have that struggle in order to overcome something, and it becomes something of value. And I think often when we look at other artists, uh, we assume, this is an artist. Oh, he can do this and he can do that. And of course, there is a, a part of it that you have a certain skill, and it's not like you suddenly don't know how to draw a figure or something. But uh, at the same time, it's not something that you own and that you can just use all the time. It's a matter of focus and trying to get into that zone of the right energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an interesting time too to mention that I think we're all trying to seek that out. But what's wacky is the reality we are in a worldwide pandemic. And I think that's what I've been struggling a little with myself is that I'm seeking out that flow and seeking out that creative space. But I think we can also like give ourselves a little permission that might be a little harder to do it these days with all that's going on, and like that's kind of okay.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's very important that you mentioned that because
yeah,
I think a lot of people struggle with this.
yeah, and I think everyone has a certain predisposition to getting in that space. I kind of relate it. I love my athletics, and my main therapy during these recent times has been a gym. Couldn't have made a better decision to build a home gym in January than right
Wow.
now. Um, but so yesterday, I like working out legs, and yesterday I just had a bad workout. It just wasn't good, and I'm like, why? And I'm sure if I like really got into it, I could look at like what I was eating around it, maybe my mind state, etc. And I think it's the same thing with art. You have like your good drawing days, and then you have your bad drawing days, and you try to figure out what are the circumstances that creates a good drawing day. And at the same time, you can't tell clients, oh, I'm having a bad drawing day. I can't deliver my
I know.
content. Like your work has to be at like a certain level that it's always competent.
Yeah.
But I think over time we kind of learn like what do you need to create that artwork to be well.
Yeah.
Some people start early in the morning, some people start later in the day, some people need to start with some physical activity or not. Some need to meditate, some not. And yeah, you're right. You work so hard to put yourself in that spot because it's so perfect.
Yeah. Do you have routines like you just mentioned, or ways that work for you?
There's a couple things. The more I can accomplish by noon, the better I feel.
Okay.
I've realized that's true, which is tough because I can wake up at 7:30 every day, no problem. But I know to be optimal waking up at 5:30 or 6, I have a lot better day. And that's
Okay.
an ongoing struggle. That's just me, right?
Hmm.
That's important. I've also found of intense importance is midway through the day to do an activity that causes me to forget about art is huge. So whether that's like right now, I'm running, I either work out, maybe even take like a quick nap or something. Because no matter, I love art, but I'll just kind of get burnt out if I don't get that release and forget about all that. Um, and then I'm not sure if I have anything other than that. I suppose trying to compartmentalize emails,
Right.
because I
Yeah.
love emails. I think they're efficient, and I hate emails because I get a lot. It's just I'm a professional emailer, part-time artist is how I feel sometimes. I think balancing that's good. So,
Yeah.
waking up early, moving my body midway through the day, and not getting too lost in emails. If I can accomplish those tasks, usually my day will be decent.
Yeah.
How about
Yeah.
you?
I do the same thing with emails. I think when you when you mentioned that I'm a part-time email and a part-time an artist, I feel like email hardly ever is as fulfilling. So I want to keep the time I spend on my emails as limited as possible. So I just have a couple of times a day where I look at it. That works best for me. At the moment, these are things that change over time if I find a better way. Um, I'm really in the middle of changing my process, because up to not so long ago I was just um you know not thinking so much about all these things, and it got me to the point where I almost uh, burned out. So right now I'm really scheduling everything. I'm scheduling uh, the time I work, the time I relax, and it sounds like it's all really rigid, but in reality it's the other way around, because I know from then to then I don't have to worry about anything, because I know everything is taken care of in my schedule. It's basically what you mentioned when you take a nap or try to forget about art for a while. I think it's important to uh, to do that. I have a dog now, so I walk the dog and have fun with that. So I think I truly believe that the balance between working effectively and relaxing is super important. And I know this so well because I am the one who ignored that fact the most.
Me
That
and you too, or you and me too, man. I was the worst at that. So yeah,
mm,
that's what I'm working
mm.
towards too. Can if I could, I'd like to share a story that really helped me towards that end.
Oh, please do.
Uh, so, corny warning. This might seem corny, like a parable your uncle might tell, but it really helped me, and
Mm,
maybe it might help someone else out there. Um, is okay. I'm gonna try my best. That there were two. Um, oh, geez. What are the guys that chop down trees? What are they called?
woodchuck? I I don't know.
Geez, I'm starting off horrible here. Anyways, loggers. We'll call them loggers. So, anyways, they're going out and they both start to chop down their trees. And so once it gets to lunchtime,
Hmm.
the one says, I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna really grind forward, and I don't need to eat. I'll finish a little earlier, right? And then the other one says, uh, "All right, I'll see you in a little bit. I'm gonna go into town, and I'm gonna have lunch, and I might stop by and get my blade sharpened." And you can see where this is going. So then it comes to around, say, like 3:30 or 4, and the one logger is worked all day, but unfortunately his blade got really dull and his strikes to the tree weren't doing very much.
Mm.
So then the other fellow was wrapping up, right? He didn't exert as much energy, and he's like, "All right,
Oh,
man,
wow.
see you tomorrow."
That's so
And
cool.
he finished his job. So the point is that for most of my career, I was the first guy that just said, I'm going to always do my art all the time. And I didn't take time to sharpen my mind or my health or any of these things. And I've since found that I can still be as useful or quality of an artist, but take time out to do other things. And it
Yeah.
kind of sharpens me up that the time I do spend doing art is still useful. So that story really helped
Yeah.
me. Maybe it resonates with some people.
Yeah, well, with me, absolutely. I see in the chat people are saying lumberjacks.
Lumberjacks, right?
That's it,
Easy.
right?
Yeah.
So let me check the chat for a second. So Trey Bryan says, "How's it going, Francis? Listening while painting." Dustin Clark says, "What do you think is the most valuable thing I can teach my high school art students?"
First off, what's up, Trey? Trey's an amazing painter. I think down in New Orleans, he always pushed me to be better in school. I was always like, man, I wish I could be as good as Trey Bryan. Um, and then the question was something valuable to give to high school students.
Yes.
Let me see. I think drawing from life is important, and using reference isn't cheating. Because I'm just, in my job, I review a lot of high school applicants, and I'd say the vast majority are drawings from imagination, which I want to encourage and I think is great. And that's how a lot of us get into art in the first place, is just drawing monsters and all sorts of fun stuff. But I think if you can find a way to connect with that young artist and show them how drawing from life and from photo reference is useful and could be a tool, and it could be just as exciting. And there should be that balance. I think that could be really helpful. I also think that uh, just sharing a lot of exciting artists is a big deal. And high schoolers are particularly stubborn, I think, sometimes. And when they see an old artist, it's like, oh, there's another one of these old artists that's in the museum, all this boring stuff. So I think you got to be kind of slick, try to show a balance of some of those old artists, but then kind of connect it to a contemporary, very hip artist that'll obviously connect with the high schooler and draw the parallels and show them how they're kind of the same, and I think a light bulb might go off. So like showing James Jean, but then next to Hokusai, and like showing that, I think as a high school teacher could be really really exciting. And I think also for high school students, especially their families, I think a lot of high school students struggle with maybe wanting to pursue art, but their family might not support it or understand it, either consciously or from unfortunate ignorance or whatever. So I think if there's a way that a high school program could bring in professionals to show that art, there's a ton of work in art. It's as legit pursuit as anything else. I think that could bridge the gap between the idea of a starving artist for the students and for the families also. Because I think many times, at least I'm just talking from where I'm from, but there's a very limited idea of what being an artist can do, and it's kind of discouraged. So
That's a
hopefully
great
that.
answer, I think. We have another question. Vico Friedley says, now that you mentioned reference, I've seen many artists that trace from reference. I think that is cheating. What do you think?
Um, that's a tough one. I think in general, if you're trying to cover up
Mm.
shortcomings by tracing reference, really bad idea, because you're not going to grow. I think the huge reality, spoiler alert, is a lot of some of my favorite mid-century illustrators were tracing a lot because they were trying to hit their deadlines. So it's not a black and white type of thing. I even know Greg Manchez, and I might be wrong, so someone please correct me, but I'm almost certain Greg Manchez says when he was a student, he would trace a lot of photos and it taught him shorthand, and then he would go and draw raw from those photos later on. So I think you'll know in your spirit if if you're using a photo and you're tracing it and it feels kind of wrong, like you're skipping the act of giving life to your piece, then don't do it. And hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think Drew Struzan too, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think that also has to do with the fact that, he had super tight deadlines, and there was no way he could play with likeness. They had to be spot on like a photograph. So that's literally what he was aiming for. So probably, I'm absolutely sure he can draw them like that, but for the sake of time, and also since he wants to end up with that result anyway, it makes sense. However, I do feel that you miss out on some elements. For example, when you think of shape, the way you can express form in a portrait, for example, and you trace the portrait, there's no way you can push little things if you trace and if you understand, what those shapes are, and because you can get to a certain point where you can just look and draw and get the likeness right. So that's exactly what you mentioned. If it's covering up a shortcoming, then what is the reason why you do it? I would, for example, when I was studying trace photos, but not to create a beautiful drawing, but just to understand the dimensionality of it. So someone was wearing a big jacket, and I would just trace it, but draw the body underneath that jacket. What's the direction of that arm? Where does it go? How are the shapes connected? And for me, that was a way of studying. So it depends on how you use it. And another thing I thought about this week about reference was that I think it's funny that people call drawing from reference cheating, because if it's figurative, it's always based on reference. It can be reference in your mind, but if you have never seen a dog, you will not be able to draw a dog. So you must reference the time that you saw a dog. So if it can be direct when you put the reference next to your drawing and copy that, or it can be a dog that is in your mind. If you look at for thousands of hours at dogs, you can draw them by heart because you know so well what they look like because you looked at the reference. So in a way, everything figurative is based on reference. But maybe that's a lame answer. I don't know. It was
I,
just a thought.
I think so. And I think, uh, if you do want to draw from the imagination, and let's just entertain the idea that that's the purest form of art. I'm not saying that, but let's just do an experiment. If we're saying drawing from your imagination is the goal, then that's almost assuredly going to be the result of spending a long time drawing from life or from reference, to the point where you've internalized so many of those lessons and information that you can then draw from your imagination. So to go completely from young artist just drawing from imagination to just incredibly killer drafts person, there's going to be some reference in there. Now, there's no rules in art. I'm sure that you can find people that broke that, but for sure. And it might be neat too if we were talking about art history. So I'm taking I mentioned I was taking my grad class, so I had the option to take an elective. So because I'm very interested in sort of photography's relationship with art, I'm taking a history of photography class, and I have an excellent teacher. And check this out. So Leonardo da Vinci was way back, started to understand about the idea of the camera obscura, how you can how an image can kind of go through a hole and it shows up elsewhere and like reverse or whatever. The earliest idea of what a camera could be. Check it out as a little nerd fact. He wrote that in his journal backwards, so that when it was flipped, you could see it just like the camera obscura. I love it.
Didn't he
But
do all his notes backwards?
were they all of them?
I think so. Yeah, I think all of his notes were backwards.
Oh, well, see, I didn't know that. That's even really crazy. I thought it was just on the camera. Right
Okay,
on.
okay. Well,
No,
I
that I
might be
mean,
wrong.
no further proof that the guy's on another. So, then, over time, then you had the camera obscura, and, artists were exploring the idea of using grid systems, and, like you have Vermeer and all the proof that he was almost like projecting perspective onto his canvases. And then, in 1829, as soon as the camera was invented, artists were asking how they can use it in their art. Like the next day, so
Mm.
painters like, I can probably use that. And like Degas and Munch on all these artists. And then we get to the current day. So I think that's
Yeah.
really exciting because illustration, particularly, has been an art form that it's a popular commercial art form that also always reacts to technology.
Mm.
And I think that's exciting because I was very stubborn when digital painting was becoming popular. Like when I was in school, I'm like, that's not real art. And obviously, I realize that's not the case now. I was just stubborn. So now we're at the point where if illustration has always reacted to technology, art has always um, reacted to technology. I mean, absolutely, we're going to start reacting to VR and AR. And so I just had like, I might be going a bit of a tangent, but I just had my buddy who works at Magic Leap, who is a augmented reality studio in Florida. They're basically working in the future. What does the future look like? So he in one of these like chats, we were able to see what his eyes were looking at in augmented reality, and in a couple minutes he painted a 3D scene of an environment that he can move in and out of infinitely. So then, and he's also hosts all of his meetings at his company, like the Star Wars sort of like hollow projections where they're all in a room and they're. But anyway,
Wow. That is cool.
so I said, I'm like, Tyler, does that mean that uh, if I'm working on a scene of Batman punching Superman, I could do a quick naive sculpt in like 5 minutes and then literally in augmented reality or virtual reality walk around that scene, try to find the ideal angle, like close my eyes or whatever to screen cap that, and then use that as reference to kind of figure out angles for the scene.
Mm.
And already like they're using that in pre-visualization for movies,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. So it's like using that goes, so hopefully I'm able to bring this fully back. So that goes to the idea of, is using reference cheating? Artists have always tried to use the tools available to create the best pictures possible. And I think that's exciting to think, well, what are those tools going to be in the future and how we're going to use them? And if we keep an open mind and the final product is engaging and exciting and has a strong concept and narrative and interesting mark making, whatever tools used to get there are, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more about honesty or authenticity than the tool that you use. You can create a stamp and do hundreds of painting to make money. That will bring you money maybe, but it will not help you grow as an artist. And I think if you have something to express and you want to learn as an artist, and you combine those, I think then it doesn't matter what technique you use. I think there are more questions. Let's have a look. Trey Bryan says you're amazing. Responding to your reaction. Um, let's see. David Rose says I always thought that tracing was an unforgivable sin. And then Dustin Clark says it's actually hard to trace well. I've learned that it's a skill. If you are tracing to create something new or to learn something, it can be super helpful. I absolutely teach my HS students tracing. It can be a useful tool, if they are tracing and turn off their brain or plagiarize, it's wrong. Um, Drawing with a grade is the same thing as tracing. It just takes longer. I don't know if I think that's with a grid. Supposed. Oh yeah,
Okay.
drawing with a grid. Um, that's exactly, that's also a tool that you can use. And by the way, I think someone mentioned that also. If you don't have any skills and you trace a photo, you will not be able to understand what you did. You don't even know which lines to trace, or how to render it then. So um, it's just a starting point.
Yeah. And you're also not giving yourself the opportunity to dive into the beauty of drawing. I mean, debatably, that's why most of us are here, is having a piece of paper and the search for something exciting. If you take that away from yourself, that's a bit of a
Exactly,
bummer.
exactly, yeah. And you mentioned photography. I uh, I find that we are so used to photography, also in film, that it became our default way of thinking that's what the world is, that's what reality is. And what I love about painting is that uh, that's not what reality is. And as a painter, you can create completely different marks and express reality in a different way. Just like a poet can create sentences that might even feel wrong, or you have to think about what could that mean. He's using words, but not the way we're used to help you look at the world in a different way. And I think painters can do that too. You can uh, break the rules of the reality as we know it, because often people say, well, that's a beautiful painting, it looks just like a photo, or the other way around. When people see a beautiful photograph, and oh, it's just like a painting, because that's the reference. But when you can break through that, uh, for example, David Levine I mentioned, when you see his watercolors, that's not rendered the way a photo is rendered. And sometimes you just see the drops of water of the watercolor go right through the face, uh, but it expresses a certain emotion, a certain personality of the people he portrayed. And that's what I think is really interesting, uh, where you can break out of that fixed way of looking at the world, which is, uh, in a way, I see it as creating symbols and which is really useful, just like traffic signs. They are really clear and everyone understands them the exact same way. And that's important, because when you're on the road, you have just 1 second to look at the traffic sign and we all have to understand it. But in art, you know that there's not the danger that you crash into another car. So you have all the time just to wander around in that world and try and create, a different way of, and it can be something that I notice that no one notices in that way, and I can express it that way, and invite you into my world, and the other way around when other artists do their paintings. That's what I really love about art.
And I think you do that so well, man, is that, you have this ability to interpret your subject matter in so many different ways. And I can tell you're just sort of playing with that interpretation. And, in my own way, I'm somewhat trying to do the same. Is, the camera exists and it can be used in all sorts of ways. And, the holder, the user of the camera, is going to document the world, um, using the camera as a medium, and you're getting a certain type of results. And I think in the same way, we're trying to ask ourselves, how are we going to document and record the world, and how are we going to interpret it? And I think it's like developing our own language.
Yeah.
And like, there's definitely, like, you have your own marks, and hopefully I'm starting to maybe make a couple marks that kind of look like my marks. But if we think of it like a language, um, if we're inventing a whole new language, then if we sample a little bit here and there, again, just to go to the idea of like being aware of looking at stuff, we can kind of be enriched from that. So, anyways, I'm just agreeing absolutely with what you said for sure.
Oh, cool, cool. Well, I think it's a beautiful way to conclude the conversation. I think we've talked over an hour, so um, thank you very much for being on the stream. Thanks everyone for joining in, and I will see you all next time. I will post on my social media when and with who the next live stream will be. So see you then.